everyone. Today I want to talk to you from my home studio here about hybrid drawings of animals using Micron pens. So I have here at my desk my chosen image, and the first couple of things you're going to need to do are go online and choose one option from all of the options that I've uploaded, and you're going to need to print out your image. If you are not printing your image, you're going to have a little bit less accuracy, and it's a bit less time efficient if you are not having the printed version, because I'm going to be going over tracing and how to trace your animal image. So the way that we will be working is first from the animal image and tracing the image onto your paper, and then you'll be working from observation with an object that is up to you. Look around in your house and think about your concept, think about how your animal and your object can work together, and consider the concept as well as the scale of each item, so that you have a certain part that's identifiable from each. So you will most likely need to overlap the two parts and potentially crop parts out. So just think about how you're putting the two together. So I've chosen the deer image here. So this is the photo that I've printed, and I'm going to be working from that. And I've chosen as my object a little toy bus that I have. And so my thought there was deer in headlights. So starting with the animal printout, I want to begin by putting graphite across the back side, and I recommend using a high number, a 4B or 6B or an 8B, so that you're using soft graphite across the back. So I've already gone across and done this to speed this up, but just go across the entire back surface. I've left a tiny bit of a margin just because you really only need the graphite where the image of the animal is, so just leaving a little bit around the edges is not going to matter too much. If you do have something important that goes all the way to the edge in your image, make sure you include graphite all the way to that spot. So all the way across, so that it's as dark and heavy as what mine is, approximately. And then the graphite is going to be transferred onto your paper. So we're using graphite to start with, just so that we can plan things out and get the two parts to work together before we get working with Micron pens, which are more permanent. So we want to make sure to have our composition figured out first. So in order to trace, I'm going to show this on my large drawing pad. You want to use your 18 by 24 paper and consider the placement when you are beginning your trace. So wherever you decide to start this, just make sure that you're leaving enough extra space or negative space on the top or the bottom or left or right for that hybrid object element. If you do not, you may regret this position later and have to retrace your image. So do think about that from the start. And I recommend beginning with a piece of tape on the top. You could do top and bottom, but I like the top secured. Let's just show that you can see the tape there. So the top is secured because if I were to look at my image underneath, I can kind of flip it up and it will remain in that same position. You can double secure it, like I said, if you want, with two pieces. So wherever you press on the front, the back side is going to transfer onto your paper. So you want to make sure you are pressing and tracing all of the important elements, the big general shapes first, and then moving on to your details and smaller shapes. So for the trace, I'm using, I've got a 2H, So I recommend a light pencil, either something like a 2H, an H, or nothing heavier than or darker than probably a B, because you don't want to you don't want to cover the image with your pencil lines. You want to still be able to see those details when you eventually go into developing your textures and your values. So for now, a light line is all you want. So what I'm going to do is demo what this will look like if I go all the way around. And the more you put that kind of heavy pressure, the more this is going to work out well. So I'm going to just go all the way around the outside. Oh. So you see, if I move it, I've still got the position there because of my tape. Going around. And another thing you want to do, I always recommend doing the entire image here, even if in your hybrid version you're going to be eliminating some aspect of your animal. In my case, I'm changing the head. I'm editing out the head and editing in my toy bus. And so, although that's the case, I still recommend going ahead and tracing the entire head, because you might decide later you want aspects of it, or you just want to know the position and the placement there, so that when you go to match the perspective, so that it looks like a fairly smooth transition to your object, you have a bit better of an idea on that placement in that area. So I'm not going to go into all of the details here in this demonstration, but I do recommend more is better as far as how many shapes to trace. So the more you trace, the more accuracy you will have when you go to develop your details. Alright, so I'm just going to go and check underneath. I'm going to flip this up so you can see. And I've got a pretty good outline there. I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to zoom this in here so you can have a better look. See, the outline of my deer is pretty well executed on the page. I can get more information by continuing to trace the details, and you can go back and forth and check how you're doing. In the interest of time, I have already done a little bit more on this and combined my object with the deer to show you a more finished version, or an in-process version of what you want to be doing here. So on my sketchbook, I've got my deer with more of those details you can see traced, and then I have taken my bus and tried to match the same exact perspective and close to the scale. So the size is going to look kind of clunky if I make this the same scale compared to a deer as it wouldn't be in real life. We wouldn't have enough space for it. So you want to make sure that one or the other object is most likely going to need to shift in scale or size. So I've made this a lot smaller so that it matches about the right size for the head of the deer. So by holding it up, I can try and match the perspective of the head, and it's going to have a bit more of a seamless transition from the neck into that spot. Do consider how your textures might transition. In my case, it's a bit more abrupt. If you had a different sort of break, so I have a little bit of a smoother transition here on the ears. I've decided to include those ears because there's a little bit more back and forth that way. If you only have one and then the other object, they might not read as much as a hybrid. It might appear, it can appear as though it's just two separate objects. So make sure that wherever you place your object, it kind of makes sense with the other shape as well, the shape of the deer. And then consider what additional thing you could add, or how many ways you can bring together the two visually and conceptually. So your Micron pens, I want to jump into how you are going to use this material, since it is a new way of working. It is more permanent. They are fine point pens. I have 3. You are only required to use 1. So depending on which one you have, you will, if you have the set, you can. I would recommend playing around with, experiment with your different pressures, your different line widths that you can get. So I have a 0.5, a 0.3, and a 0.1. And so this one was the 0.5, that's my largest. This one was my 0.3, and the 0.1 is very fine, very tiny lines. So you can see the difference there. My line work, when I go into it, I recommend starting with, if you have this range, start light, start with light pressure, or start with your lighter of whatever pens you have. So I'm starting with my 0.1, and I want to make sure I'm continuing to look back at this reference image, so don't throw this away after you've traced it. Make sure you are looking at that for your values and your textures. And I think it's smart to begin with your darker values, especially if you have some hesitations about using a very dark permanent material like this. So I have started mine already with the hooves of the deer here, because the hooves are the darker of the elements that I'm including here. And if you look at how I'm using my marks, there are different ways that you can use the pen. You can use hatching lines, so those are really great for fur texture. So if your animal has fur or feathers or something similar, you want to use just some dash lines. We've gone over hatching lines already, so this is nothing new. It's just a different material using the same hatching lines. The other mark that you could use is a stipple, which is basically just dots. Stippling is the word for multiple dots together to create a value, and I think that the stippling technique works best for an area that has a smoother surface. So on my bus, that's a smoother, different texture than the fur of the deer. So I'm gonna maybe use the stippling technique there. So I can just show a little bit of that. And this, depending on how you layer it can be fairly easy to control, as long as you are starting with, light pressure, starting with your lines or your stippling dots farther apart, and then building up to a darker value. So bring this in closer, give you a better look. So if you look at the bumper there, that's where I was working. It's not super dark, but it is starting to come together in some places in that area where I went darker or more congested with my marks. So practice the way that you're using your marks. Either hatching lines or stippling is the way to go, and then Lastly, you want to consider, this is at the very end once you've basically gone through everything in your images, putting them together, getting all of the values and the textures that you want. A final consideration is some areas it is better to use pencil. I think it works well in the final stages to go back into areas that need better blending, or a spot where it's so light that the Micron pen is creating too much contrast. So an example might be on the bus here, this white area that's very shiny and smooth. There's not a whole lot of contrast happening there, so rather than going in with my Micron pen, I might just go in that area with my graphite pencil, and then we'll get a nice range, a full range of values with those lighter grays contrasting what's happening with the Micron pen. The other example I'll show is here in the fur. If I wanted to create a little bit more shadow across but not go as dark as the wheels of the bus, I want to keep those values, you know, separated, but have a bit more flow between my marks in the fur underneath. So I can just go across and layer a bit of graphite on top of that. Or I could blend out from an area, so I'll continue in this same spot. If I wanted to create a smoother transition in that fur that I couldn't get with the Micron pen, because if you have a larger pen, it will be a bit darker lines that you're getting. So in order to blend that out easier, you can use graphite along the edge of a shape of value, just to kind of feather it out into a lighter value. All right, now the very last thing I want you to consider is your context. There isn't a requirement to include a lot of, you know, details or anything necessarily, but I would like you to have something minimal. So the minimal option would be just a cast shadow. I can show a little bit of that cast shadow coming through here. This could be with graphite, this could be with Micron pen, or with both. If you want to add other elements, it might be fun to add a road that the deer is, you know, walking across. Add those, you know, extras, because it's going to really make the concept come together. So start with your trace, play around with the Micron pens, and have fun with the concept here. Consider the whole page and how the two parts work together and transition nicely using this material. All right, good luck.